efforts that Obaida mentioned. After I graduated, I went straight to Texas for a year, where I did a year of research in cardio-oncology at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. It was around that time when I also prepared my application for residency, went to interviews, and I ultimately matched in Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, Michigan, where I spent 3 years to do internal medicine residency and then another year as a chief resident. And I'm currently a cardiology fellow, about to finish my first year of cardiology fellowship at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. I'm particularly interested in interventional cardiology with a focus on pulmonary vascular procedures and invasive management of pulmonary embolism and pulmonary hypertension. And given my research background in cardio-oncology, I developed quite the clinical interest in this field as well. But really my main interest is now more spending time with my 2-year-old son. This picture is a little old. He's a better drummer than I am, I can promise you that. So just to kind of set the tone for today's discussion, I had this open-ended question for you, and I was recently asked this question myself, so I spent some time reflecting on this. So how do you define a successful career? That's a question for you guys, so please feel free to unmute and give me a few answers. Don't be shy.
If no one's going to do it, I'm going to go. I think one where you find a good work-life balance and you're also financially good. I think I define that as a successful career, and also one that brings us a sense of achievement. I think that that's important.
Fully agree. I think those are all important elements. And the finance aspect, it's a little taboo. People say don't do medicine for money, and that is true, but it is an important aspect of one's life, and we'll go over that as well. All right, anyone else?
Probably when you like Viara said, when you get that sense of achievement, usually a lot of people start planning their life from like high school. So I think a successful career is like when you finally get to achieve all of the stuff on maybe your dream board or your mood board or your vision board or something like that.
Yeah, so achievement. Agree with that. Anyway, let's take 2 more answers. So people kind of knowing of you and intentionally inviting you to share your experience so far, okay?
And be happy at your workplace.
Be happy at your workplace. Yep. All that sounds about right. So here are sort of the answers that I came up with, and here's kind of what I think. I think sense of purpose is number 1. I think that's essentially a synonym for the sense of achievement that you guys already mentioned. And this is probably true not just for a career, but life in general. Probably purpose is what drives us. Something that you're competent at. I think you can't feel that you have a successful career if you fake it till you make it. You actually have to be good at what you're doing. You have to provide an objective benefit, and that can be somewhat interpretable. But I think you can tell if you're doing good for those you're responsible for directly, or by teaching or researching ways to indirectly impact whoever it is you're trying to impact. And then one that does provide sufficient time and social and financial stability to make sure you and your family are physically safe, have your healthcare, educational needs covered, and that does allow for community involvement. And so I think, when you draw the line, essentially, if I were to mention another point, that probably would be happiness. So I'm fully in line with what you all guys mentioned. All right, now let's be a little more applied. Why even consider coming all the way to the US to be a cardiologist? Well, there are pros and cons. Pros, it's true that the US does provide world-leading healthcare services. There's no doubt about that. And it does so through essentially limitless resources. Sometimes it's just kind of silly how many resources you have available just at the tip of your fingers. It's kind of intimidating sometimes. And that's why I think for us as physicians, especially in this country, we have to be very careful with what we end up recommending our patients, because the cost can actually go way high. It's true that physicians do get paid reasonably well. You do tend to have access to world-class research. English language was a big pro for me. I preferred in med school to, I already spoke English, and I preferred to focus on studying medicine than studying a language that I was not familiar with. And maybe compared to other spots, there's somewhat less left to chance. I think it is a meritocratic place, or there's as much meritocracy as possible in any given system. So that's something that functions, and I think it's true here more than in other places. But it's not a perfect pathway. It's long, it's expensive. It takes years to get up to a certain point where you can check off those boxes of a successful career. People here do work far more than Europe, have less vacation time. It's very far from Romania, so if there's any situation where you need to, let's say, urgently come back to Romania, that can be a little tedious. The healthcare system here can be just overwhelming, and I was saying that I didn't want to learn another language. I'd rather learn medicine. When once I started here, probably the bulk of my intern year was to just figure out the healthcare system. So that can be a field in and of itself. Access to healthcare is not very homogeneous. There's the social categories in this country are quite obvious, unfortunately. And adding to that problem is the fact that insurance companies are the literal devil, and you sometimes have to interact with them, and you advocate for your patients to get the care they need, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way, unfortunately. But still, it's a good place in which to be a doctor. And I was looking up the best cardiology hospitals in the world, and there are all sorts of tops and lists. This is from one of the more reputable publications. Essentially, out of the top 20 best hospitals in the world, according to this publication, 11 are in this one country, the United States. So that means something. And just to give you an example of what a high volume center looks like, and this is clearly a shameless plug for my current institution, is that, for example, a few years ago, we did about 50,000 transthoracic echocardiograms, about 8,000 transesophageal. This hospital where I'm currently at has 7 EP labs, 6 cath labs, all of them functioning all the time. We do 4,000 heart surgeries. We do about 4,700 coronary angiograms throughout a year with 1,500 PCIs. And the numbers for the structural procedures, so the TAVRs, MitraClips, and TMVRs, they're just going up. So this is already almost 5 years old. Right now, I think we're north of probably 500 TAVRs, north of 100 MitraClips. The TMVRs, I don't even know how many we do. This procedure is exploding. And now we just starting doing TriClips. We're replacing every possible valve through catheters. It's really cool, and not a lot of places have something like that. On the imaging side of things, you get to learn and study from folks who are, Dr. C up there on the top left, she's the president of the American Society of Nuclear Cardiology. Dr. O in that picture, he literally wrote the echocardiography book. So you get access to people like this. And in the picture in the bottom right over there, that's Dr. Rick Nishimura, who essentially wrote all the valve guidelines. So that's not true for all institutions in this country, but you do have better odds at access to folks like these and true mentors. There are more than 30 MRI devices in this one hospital. It's kind of crazy to think of. And we have a very structured fellowship training. We have clear didactics, and we get protected time from our clinical duties to attend these sorts of didactics. They tend to be really good. And overall, obviously not every hospital in this country will have these types of numbers, but the overall structure of a training program is similar. And the odds of you meeting, somebody who is a big name in the field is reasonably high. And just to get it out of the way, yes, physicians do get paid reasonably well. Now, these numbers showed in the left, they show for all physicians and then specialists and primary care physicians. And then the chart on the right shows per specialty. Now, these salaries are gross salaries, so you won't get nearly as much in your pocket, and you have to pay for all sorts of taxes, insurance, and so on and so forth. But regardless, physicians still get paid well here. So can you be a cardiologist in the US? Well, the answer is yes, but you have to understand there are some limitations to that ambition, and to some extent it's up to you how far you want to go. So you need to have some reasonable expectations, especially in the beginning when you're not going to be shoulder to shoulder with US graduates, and that's normal. So just to look at some numbers, I have some numbers here from the residency match in 2022, so a recent match. So let's say, if you're interested in cardiology, you have to do internal medicine residency. So out in 2022, we look at this category here, the non-US IMGs. That's us, non-US international medical graduates. So there were about 2,500 who applied. So that's a decent number out of and when you take into account especially the US MDs that were 3,500. But if you look at something like orthopedic surgery, out of 875 positions, only 11 were non-US IMGs. So if you want to be an orthopedist in the US, probably tough luck. It'll be extremely hard to impossible to achieve that, no matter how good you really are. And in terms of match rates, the match rates for IMGs has been around 50 to 60% in the past few years. There was a dip 10 some years ago, if not 20 years ago, but I think it kind of stabilized in the recent 5 to 6 years between 50 to 60%. So that can sound intimidating, especially when you consider the MD rate to be above, the US MD rate to be above 90%. But that, shouldn't stop you from applying, because you don't know what those 40-some% who didn't match, you don't know what their profiles were and what they were doing. You should also have some expectations about where you're going to end up, at least for residency. So these are the top states that are so-called IMG friendly with the highest number of international medical graduates. Again, this is for the residency match, not the fellowship match. So odds are, if you apply, you're going to end up in one of these states. And that was true for me. I ended up in Michigan. And these are absolute numbers. You see California on the list, for example. But if you look at the percentages of IMGs versus non-IMGs, you see that in California, actually, although the absolute number is relatively high, only 12% of folks who matched were IMGs. Whereas, it's 42% in New Jersey, 32% in New York State, 29% in Michigan, and so on. So odds are you're going to end up in one of these states if you apply for residency. Now, what about fellowship? Well, the most accessible specialties for IMGs are endocrine, nephro, medical genetics, IP, but you have to do, that's interventional pulmonology, but you do have to do pulmonary fellowship first before that, and then rheumatology. Actually, quite a few folks who match into these specialties, 30 to 40% are international grads. So there's a good chance to get into one of these specialties if you so choose. And when we look at the number of IMGs who applied for fellowship match, they're actually better than the residency match. So about 76% this year, this most recent match, about 76% of non-US IMGs matched. And that's compared to about 90-some% for the US MDs. So you actually have better chances of matching into a fellowship than you do into residency. What about cardiology in particular? Well, there were about 1,200 positions, cardiology fellowship positions last year, this last match in 2024. 26% of them were international medical graduates. So that's also a decent number, especially when you consider how competitive cardiology is, even for US graduates. So these are overall, I'd say, encouraging numbers. Now, before we move on to actually talk about some specifics of the application process, I want to make sure we all, speak the same language, and that we all know that the ECFMG is the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates. The USMLE stands for the United States Medical Licensing Exam. ERAS is the Electronic Residency Application Service, and RMP is the National Resident Matching Program. We're going to talk about these in detail, so if you don't know what these are, don't panic. So, pathway to cardiology training in the US. It's relatively straightforward, right? You have to take your STEP exams, you have to get a certificate from the ECFMG, you have to send your application through the ERAS platform, You have to go through the National Residency Matching Program, the NRMP, and match to a residency. You have to do residency, and you have to take it from scratch with ERIS and NRMP. It's the exact same process. And then you do cardiology fellowship. And although this path is straightforward, as I just mentioned, the process is quite competitive. So there are a lot of factors that go into a successful fellowship match. Things that you have to consider that, didn't even cross my mind when I was just starting this journey. You have to, finish med school. That I thought I probably should do. You have to do volunteer activity. That improves your CV. But then there's a bunch of research. There's a ton of costs that you just didn't even think that you need to pay for. You need to have a good family life and be a balanced person overall. There are factors that go into obtaining a medical license. The visa status is just a pain in the neck. You should be involved in medical societies and organizations. If you're in residency, do you want to do a chief year or not? Okay, you do cardiology training, but do you want to do any extra advanced fellowship like interventional cardiology or EP or so on? And the job market is crazy. And you need somebody to actually have your back and a good mentor and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of things to take into account. But I think if you focus on the straight pathway first, you will eventually get there. It doesn't mean to dismiss the collaterals. Those are very important, but keep your direction and you will get there. So let's just do this sort of exercise. And let's say you want to practice structural interventional cardiology. You want to do mitral clips and all sorts of valves through catheters. So I use my Mayo as the example. So to practice structural interventional cardiology, you have to do a structural interventional fellowship. So that's 2 years, essentially. 1 year of general interventional cardiology, which mainly means coronary disease, and then an extra year of structural. And here at Mayo, it's one fellowship that lasts 2 years and has both of these components. Some other places will only offer coronary training for a year, and they might ask you to apply separately for structural and do a second year. But you do have to do, mostly, pretty much anywhere in this country, you have to do 2 years of dedicated interventional training to be a structuralist. So to be eligible for that, you have to complete 3 years of cardiology training. And to do 3 years of cardiology training, you need to do 3 years of internal medicine training. And there are also some general admission requirements. And what is that? Broadly, we'll get into a little more detail here, but just broadly, you need to have that ECFMG certificate. You have to be eligible for a visa sponsorship, and you have to be eligible for a license. So going back to the cardiology fellowship, which we already established is 3 years and asks you to do 3 years of internal medicine. Okay, so what do you need to do 3 years of internal medicine? Well, you have to apply through this ERIS service, which is sort of this centralized online platform that's essentially like a mailbox where you just upload your documents and send them to programs. You have to have some application materials, and you have to go through the match. So what does application materials mean? Well, I won't spend too much time on this. It's kind of the stuff that ERIS is going to ask for anyway. So your CV, your personal statements, your medical diploma, the dean's letter, which is something that Carol Davila does provide, your transcripts from when you graduate, your USMLE transcripts, again, the ECFMG certificate, that's a recurrent theme here, and then some letters of recommendation. So let's talk about some of these aspects, the more kind of the ones that those who are just starting or considering this pathway may not be all that familiar with. So the ECFMG certificate is a big one, as you saw. So the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates is this organization whose role is essentially to say to the medical license board that you, as someone who trained in medical school outside of the US, have all the necessary qualifications and essentially are, at the same level as graduates of US medical school. So that's their role in a nutshell. They do that by offering this certificate. You need to be ECFMG certified to enter the match, and you need to have that certificate to be eligible to sit for step 3. And you need step 3 and the ECFMG certificate to actually be eligible for a full medical license. And there are a bunch of other requirements on top of that, but let's keep it simple for now. Now, the way you get these ECFMG certificate changed quite a bit in the past, 3 years or so. There used to be an exam called the Step 2 Clinical Skills. there was a standardized test that both USMDs and international grads had to take. So you all took the same exact test. Because I'm old, I ended up actually catching this, so I did take this exam. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, what are the specific requirements for the ECFMG certificate? There are 4 of them. One of them is that the med school should be listed in this World Directory of Medical Schools. And there has to be a note in there stating that graduates or students of this medical school can apply. Unfortunately, Carol de Villa fills this requirement. Well, you have to submit an online application, which is a little tedious, but it's feasible. You need to have the International Relations Office help you out with it, though. It used to be that you can only do it on paper. Well, it was an online portion. There was a paper portion, this Form 186. I think it can be done online now. You might actually be, if you're involved in this process, if you've gone through it, you probably know this better than I do. I had to send it on paper. Third part is the examination requirements. This has 2 components. That's the medical science examination, which is essentially the STEP exams, and the clinical skills requirement. And we'll delve into a little bit of detail about what this actually means. And then the medical education credential requirement, that's your medical school diploma and your transcripts. You need to graduate from medical school to be eligible for the ECFMG certificate. And they will verify it directly with the medical school. And again, the International Relations Office helps a lot. They essentially take care of this for you. So let's talk a little bit about the examination requirements, which are a little more complicated. We'll start with the medical science examination requirement. You may already know that the USMLE is the organization that holds these tests, and there are currently 3 exams. Step 1, Step 2 clinical knowledge, and Step 3. But to be ECFMG certified, you only need Step 1 and Step 2 CK. Now, some programs, most USMDs take Step 3 after they start residency. Personally, I think you should really consider taking Step 3 before you match or even before you apply for residency, because when program directors receive, thousands, literally thousands of applications from international grads, a lot of them are going to have very similar credentials. So you want to check any possible box that is going to make you stand out. Step 3 is one such box. And not only that, it makes you eligible for an H-1B visa, which we'll talk about why that's important in a bit. You need it anyway to get a full medical license. And you're going to start residency. You're going to be busy. You're going to be overwhelmed by a new system. You won't have either the time or the initiative to study for another STEP exam. So I strongly suggest that you adjust your timeline in such a way that you take Step 3 before you even apply for residency for the match. It doesn't really matter what order you take Step 1 and Step 2. You can take Step 2 CK first, if so you choose. It does make sense to take Step 1 first, though, because it's focused quite a bit on basic science, and you may end up just forgetting a lot of basic science if you wait too much. And then once you're done with that, you can focus more on clinical knowledge, which is what the Step 2 is designed for. Step 3, though, you can't take ahead of time. You have to take it after Step 1 and Step 2, and actually you have to take it after you have the ECFMG certificate in hand. So what if you fail? Well, you can't attempt a single step for more than 4 times. You can take the same exam no more than 3 times within a 12-month period. But if you do pass, you can't retake. So that's it. And now Step 1 is pass-fail, so it doesn't matter as much. If you pass, the score won't be reported to the program directors. But Step 2 does give you a score. So if you take Step 2, you better be sure you're going to take a good score and not just barely pass, because you can't retake it, and the score that you get is the score that you get. And you only have a time frame of 7 years to take all of them. Now, where can you take it? There are the so-called prometric exam centers. There's one in Bucharest right now, but I just looked up, I just tried to, simulate making an appointment, and it doesn't seem to be available. Honestly, I don't know what's up with that. So if you're interested in taking these tests, you probably know this better than I do, but I'd probably reach out to these centers just to figure out, are they really administering the step or not? When I had to take it,
They
I took.
are. I'm sorry for to interrupt, just because
Oh,
people
no.
have this question all the time. But they
Yeah,
have a day every 5 weeks, which is why you probably did not find it in that 2 week time
right.
frame that they add by default. So we do not
Mm,
have it that often, but I took it here, and like the center is there. We do not have as
Excellent.
many dates as other countries, just because there are not many people applying from here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that clarification. And there you go. That's the answer for you. When I took it, you couldn't take it in Bucharest. So I took step 1 in 2016 and step 2 CK in 2017. And I had to go to Milan and Athens, and I made a little bit of vacation out of it, I'll admit, but that was kind of nice. But obviously, having one in Bucharest is really convenient. Step 3, though, you have to come to the US for. You can't take that anywhere else. They're pricey. Each step exam is basically $1,000 and has some extra fees as well. So not cheap tests. That's something to consider. Now, as I mentioned, step 1 became pass-fail relatively recently. That's a bad thing for international grads, I think, since international grads traditionally took higher scores than US grads. And it was a way for you to really demonstrate that you really know your stuff. And now with pass-fail, there will be no distinction between you and US grads in terms of step score, step 1 score at least. It was a very important criterion that program directors used to sort of do their rank list. So I think that's not good. So it means that you're going to have to focus on other parts of your application to make sure those are really strong. Step 2 CK is currently still numeric, although I hear there are some plans to change that as well. But as of now, it's still numeric, and that's a good thing. So this is now the test, the one test where you can really show program directors that you know medicine and you know medicine in the US format. Now, the somewhat confusing part is that there's not a clear maximum score. It's not like a 10 out of 10 like we have in med school. So they kind of come up with the score based on some confusing statistics that go above my head. But there's a passing score. So that's sort of the minimum that you need to pass. And then each year they report what the mean was. So these are some from a few years ago. I didn't update these for today. But overall, roughly 250-ish was sort of the mean. And that's for everyone who takes this test, US grads included. So you want at least 10 points above the mean to really distinguish you from the US grads. Now, that was kind of it for the medical science exam requirements. So now the clinical skills requirement. So this is, I think this was a little confusing to me to read because I didn't have to do this because I did the former step 2 clinical skills exam and that was it to satisfy this requirement. So they have these pathways and they're very dynamic. They seem to change every year. But here's what I understand with how they work. And again, you guys might know these better than I do at this stage. So again, this all started with the pandemic when the clinical skills test, the US grads were complaining that they have to do it. They didn't want to do it. And then the pandemic just gave the excuse for the USMLE to cancel it entirely. But so in a sense, you have one less test, but there are more conditions. So your certificates or your eligibility for a certificate can actually expire if you don't match that year and if you don't complete the first year residency training. So there are some constraints there. And the good part is that if you have an approved pathway from last year, you are not eligible for a new one, so you can have to reapply the next year. It's really, really confusing. And obviously there are costs associated with it as well. So 6 pathways. Pathway number 1, I have to admit, I don't really understand how it applies to Romania. It's for those who already completed med school and already had a license to practice medicine without supervision in any country. So, and the license doesn't even need to be actively valid, but I don't know exactly what level of training this applies for Romania. Let's say you had a license for 5 years as a resident, because residencies can be 5 or 6 years. Does it mean that you have to have 5 years as a specialist? Honestly, I don't know the answer. Some of you might, but it might not be super important anyway because you might be eligible for a different pathway. That is not pathway number 2, however. That's for folks who attend a medical school that administers the so-called OSCE exam, which is something in the US format. This doesn't exist in Romania. Now, pathway 3, this is something that you might be eligible for. So it's designated to those who attended a medical school that was accredited by an agency, an accreditation agency that's recognized by this World Federation for Medical Education. Oh boy, that's a mouthful. So I have to admit that I thought that Carol Davila graduates are not eligible for this, because if you look up the official WFME list of accredited schools, only 3 med schools in Romania show up, and that's UMF Iași, Timișoara, and Târgu Mureș. Carol Davila is not there, but Yara actually pointed out to me when I shared her slides, when I shared my slides with her, that actually Carol Davila is accredited, but for some reason it just doesn't show up on the official website. So that is not public knowledge. And if I was confused about it, odds are somebody else is going to be confused about it. Do have that PDF that Yara has showing the certificate, and then ready to show it to whoever doubts that you'd be eligible for pathway 3. So hopefully just by being a med school at Carol Davila, you are just eligible to fulfill this pathway and you don't need to worry about much else. Now, pathways 4 and 5, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. They don't apply to Romanian grads. And then pathway 6, until we got this accreditation, because this is the accreditation from what I saw, and that certificate was just offered earlier this year. So if, let's say, you were considering applying a year ago, you would not have been eligible for pathway 3, so you were stuck with pathway 6. So this is for those who are not eligible for pathways 1 through 5, and those who had a failed step 2 CS and didn't have the chance to retake it. So the ECFMG conjured this thing called the mini CEX, which is essentially they want to see that licensed physicians supervise you in some sort of semi-standardized clinical interactions. So these physicians, there have to be 6 encounters. 1 physician can only supervise a maximum of 2 encounters. So you need at least 3 separate supervising physicians. 1 single physician can supervise more than 10 applicants overall that year. You can't be related to them. They can be paid for it. They have to have had a full license for at least 5 years. But they're kind of vague as to whether they need to be US-based or not. Probably not, because it should be a full license in any country. But yeah, people are not going to be very familiar with this. So if the pathway 3 is the way to go, that's the way to go. All right, and then this clinical skills also now has this sort of occupational English test, because before this clinical skills exam also evaluated your understanding of English. So this is essentially like a TOEFL test, but with a focus on healthcare. You can take it in Bucharest. Obviously, it costs a ton of money, but yeah, it comes with the process. So it's I didn't have to take this, but it sounds like it's very similar to the TOEFL test, which I did have to take. And I hope that if you take this, you very likely won't need to take a TOEFL test. And that was to fulfill a medical license requirement. Now, visa sponsorship. This is the Achilles heel for international graduates. You need to have a legal status in the United States to practice medicine here or go through medical training here. When you apply, there's a checkbox where you have to say if you're going to need a visa or not. And usually it's not a good sign in the eyes of program directors if you need a visa, but pretty much all international grads need a visa. And broadly, there are 2 types of visas that you can come do your residency in or fellowship, the so-called J1 and the H1B. And you need a sponsor, which doesn't mean a financial sponsor. Rather, you need to have an institution say, this person needs to come to the US for medical training for these reasons. We can't take anyone else. It has to be them. And they say this to the government, and then the government approves your eligibility for one of these 2 visas. So you can't sponsor yourself. It's not a financial issue. It's sort of a need issue, and an institution has to back that. So let's talk about each type of visa. The J1 is probably the more common one. Most institutions will accept this. The sponsor is actually the ECFMG. It's not the hospital that you're planning to match in. It's easier to match in both residency and fellowship on a J1 than it is on an H1. It's valid for 7 years, which should give you sufficient time to train for almost everything, not structural interventional cardiology, but because that would be 8 years of training, but at least until general coronary interventional cardiology, for example. But the problem is that it's a visa that's not meant for intent to immigrate. It's a non-immigrant visa. So once the purpose of the visa is served, namely your training, you either need to go back to your home country for at least 2 years, or you have to enroll in the so-called waiver program, which means that you have to work in a medically underserved area for at least 3 years. There's no way around it. It's a sentence. I should say there's a way to push it by doing a so-called O visa, which is for people with exceptional capabilities, which you could argue in front of the government that you are as a medical specialist. But it won't. You can renew that essentially every year forever, but it comes with a lot of limits that you might not want to have hanging above your head forever, and you can bypass the waiver. So if you want to switch to the green cards or become a citizen, there's no way to bypass the home country requirement or the waiver. Now, some limits that I didn't think of before actually starting here was that you cannot do any kind of other job. You can't get any other kind of pay. So in residencies, sometimes on your easier rotation, some programs allow for residents or fellows to do moonlighting, which means picking up shifts on various services where there might be need, and they get paid reasonably well, and it's a big source of income while you're still in training and don't make a lot of money. And those on J1 cannot do that, and it's a limit. There's no way to convert a J1 directly to a green card, and it comes with a bunch of other limitations that I won't even go into. It's a complex visa. It's not easy to be on a J1. Now, I did my training on an H1, and it was really the best decision I could have possibly made. It has a bunch of pros. You don't have to go back to your home country. You do not have to do any kind of waiver. You can get paid by other places, so you can do moonlighting. You can convert it directly to a green card. So it's a good, strong visa. Not a perfect one, and it has some issues. It's valid for 6 years only. So let's say if you can convert it to a green card during your training, you'll only be able to do 3 years in internal medicine, 3 years of cardiology, then your visa expires. So you can't do interventional cardiology or structural unless you change it into a green card somehow. And I have a tip about that as well. You have to pass step 3 before you apply. It's a requirement. The institution that you're interested in has to be able to sponsor it. And again, it's not a financial sponsorship. It's sort of a need sponsorship, and not a lot of hospitals do that, and there are fewer and fewer that do that. Some places just do not consider folks who want to do an H. It becomes more of a problem when you want to apply for fellowship, because there are, out of 250-ish cardiology fellowship programs in the country, only about 70 offer an H. Some of them are top academic institutions that have the luxury of being able to sponsor an H, but they won't do it because they can get pretty much any resident that they want to get in the country. And then the other category is lower tier hospitals that just need manpower, and that may be more malignant than others, and they just need people. So it's something to consider if you're interested in fellowship, and I'm assuming if you're in this webinar, you are. So it's harder to match with an H. But on an H-1B visa, you can do this thing called the EB-2 National Interest Waiver, which is essentially a self-petition for a green card. So normally through general pathways, you can get a green card through 2 ways. Either you marry a US citizen, which was not an option for me because I was already married to my Romanian wife, or to have a job that's able to sponsor a green card for you. A fellowship cannot do that. It has to be a full practicing job, and some hospitals will do it, some hospitals won't. Odds are that, especially for specialty practice, they won't, or they might, but you are limited again by the timeline when the visa expires, so you might not be able to do an advanced fellowship if that's something that you'd want to do. Now there's option C, and this is this self-petition for a green card through the national interest waiver. What essentially this means in a nutshell is that you want to prove to the US government that you're an extremely qualified individual and that keeping you in this country serves the national interest. So there are a lot of ways you can phrase that, and there are different types of NIW applications. But you can do it on your own, and it's actually what I did. And I was able to get this approved, and when I was still a resident, and I converted to a green card when I was in my third year of residency, and when I applied for fellowship, I did it with a green card in hand. So you can only do this if you're on a H-1B. I should rephrase that. You can apply on a J-1, but you still need to do the waiver, the home requirement first, and only after that will you have this actually kick in. And there are different sorts of qualifications that they look at to determine if you qualify for something like this. They look at your number of publications, your number of citations, did you do peer reviews in high impact journals, things of that sort. So I applied through sort of a research pathway rather than a clinical pathway, but in the end it doesn't matter because the green card is the same no matter which pathway you apply. So if you are research savvy or interested in doing research, then I think this is the way to go. And that research year that I did before residency, that made this process possible. So that was the game changer in my case. And that year was a huge investment in my career moving forward. And I would not have been able to do this or probably come at Mayo without having done that year, without being on an H-1B, and without going through this process. You do have to work with an immigration lawyer for this, which can be pretty pricey. You can technically apply by yourself, but odds are you're not going to get approved. So it's really highly recommended to work with an immigration lawyer on this. Now, the actual residency application, as I mentioned earlier, there's this centralized platform called ERAS. There's a specific timeline that you send your application in. So there are yearly cycles. You can't just apply whenever. Typically for residency, it's September through March. So you have all this paperwork, your CV, a photograph, letters of recommendation, a personal statement, your medical school diploma, your transcript, this dean's letter that Carol Davila does offer, and your step scores. You put all of these in this website, and then you choose the programs that are registered in this website to send your application to. They'll receive it, they'll review it, they'll consider if they want to offer you an interview invitation. And then you interview, and then you have to go through the NRMP, the match process, and I have a slide on that. But just things to do on what you can do to strengthen your residency application. So again, step 2 CK score, get a green card if you can. That can be really tough before residency, but it can be done for fellowship. It's good to have some US clinical experience. That means if you're still a medical student, you can look into doing an elective. So sort of an exchange kind of rotation where you can actually come to a hospital and be involved in the clinical process and touch and see patients. The reason you cannot do that after you graduate, and from what I understand, the reason is if you do it as a med student, you're sort of have an insurance policy from the med school. So if you do anything bad to a patient, that med school umbrella policy has your back. You can't do that under any circumstances if you already graduated. So if you already graduated from med school, you can only do an observership, which means you're not involved in the clinical process per se. You can just watch a physician do their thing, or do a research pathway, which is kind of what I did. I did out of that year of research, probably like a couple of months were technically observership. The rest was a formal research. How you get these? It's a pretty heterogeneous process. There are some companies that you can pay and they'll place you somewhere to do this. I haven't done that. I think it's kind of hit or miss. and it's really expensive. So you'd be probably better served just by looking for Romanian physicians throughout the country or in areas that you're interested in, and seeing if their institutions happen to allow for observership or research. Out of the two institutions that I was recently at, Beaumont does not offer that, unfortunately. I tried for myself, and once I was there for other med students from Cardiologie. Mayo has all sorts of research pathways. They're pricey though. They're volunteer. They won't pay you. And there is actually an echo pathway that you can get paid on, but I think it's mostly for fellows, and they have like one spot a year, and it's super competitive. So odds are, if you do an observership or research, you're gonna have to pay out of pocket somehow. Yeah, it's not, your ability to get a letter of recommendation out of it might be, again, hit or miss. But you do need really strong letters of recommendation. Generally 4. 3 of them should come from a US-based doctor. I think one of them is best to come from a Romanian doctor who you worked with for a long time, preferably a professor, chair of some department. It's good to take step 3. I think that strengthens your app. It's good to have some research. Now, you don't have to have 100 papers, but at least some research, an abstract, a poster, something like that, and anything that can really set you apart. So, for example, high-level activities with the student societies, like what we've seen when we started this webinar. And your odds are going to grow if you apply to programs that have had Romanians, and especially Carol de Villa graduates. Because in the eyes of a program director, if they've never had anyone from our med school, they're not going to know where you're coming from. But if they had at least one resident or fellow who went to Carol de Villa and they were good, they're going to think, okay, everybody's going to be fantastic. I'm likely to take someone from this med school. They sort of vetted our med school for you already. Now, I mentioned this NRMP. So the National Resident Matching Program, separate from ERIS. So ERIS is the mailbox where you send your paperwork. The NRMP is where you actually rank your program. So let's say you get 10 interviews for fellowship. You interview at them. You actually go and interview, or you do the virtual interview. This NRMP is a system where you rank the 10 programs that you interviewed at in the order that you'd be interested in, actually matching in. And then the programs that you interview at, each of them will rank all the folks that they interviewed in the order that they want them to, that they're interested in. And then this algorithm matches the applicants list with the programs list and spits out a result. And that's how you learn where you're going to go for training. There are a few rules. So you can actually rank as many programs as you'd like, but there's no point in ranking programs that you haven't interviewed at, because they're not going to rank you, so you're not going to go there. And plus, adding programs on the list costs money. The match is a binding contract, so you have to go to the place that you match, or you'll be banned from future matches. You should not rank places that you don't want to go at. Even if you interview there, if it was a disastrous place that you just do not want to be in, do not rank that place. It's kind of nice that you can do a so-called couples match. So if, let's say, you have a partner or a relative or a friend, you can both make lists kind of together, and the programs will see you sort of as a couple, literally. So they'll consider both of your ranks rather than just each of one's individual ranks. It's all complex. There's a good YouTube video on it. And it's kind of funny because one place that was kind of explaining this process said that you can even do a couples list with an enemy if you want to increase your chances of not being together. I thought that was kind of funny. For residency, the match results are traditionally in March, and the academic year starts on July 1st. Now, what about fellowship? What can you do in residency to increase your chances to match into cardiology? Well, get a green card. I think that's probably the most important thing that you can do. You should try and match for residency at an institution that actually has a cardiology fellowship. I think that probably dramatically increases your chances of matching. You have to be the best internal medicine resident that they've seen. So really, I think that's where the money's at. You have to show that whatever you do, you're passionate, you're kind, you're excited, even if you're on, say, I don't know, nephrology, and you don't give a damn about the nephrons or what the creatinine is, you still have to show interest. That's how you stand out. You should try to get involved in research with cardiologists at your institution or even outside of your institution and publish something. Doing a chief resident year helps. That's an extra year added to your training, but as an IMG, you have to do everything you can. And especially if you're interested in medical education, all the better. Try and go to national meetings, get involved in national societies like the ACC and AHA. There are all sorts of educational platforms nowadays that are becoming quite notorious. So Global Cardiology University, for example, collaborates with students quite a bit. It's a great platform. The Cardio Nerds podcast is phenomenal, and they're very open to kind of interacting with trainees. So I think these are kind of the main things that you can do. Now, the fellowship match itself is basically identical to the residency match. You have to do the same ERAS platform. The match system is essentially identical. The only difference is that the timelines are slightly off. So rather than applying in September and matching in March, you apply in July, and then you learn if you match in December. But the academic year still starts July 1st. And you have to be able to have a valid visa for the duration of your training. So let's say you were on an H1, but you do a chief year on an H1, then you won't have enough visa for cardiology training. So that's a double-edged sword right there with doing the chief year. All right, well, that was pretty much the end of my talk, and I know I talked quite a bit, so I'm excited about the Q&A session. Just want to conclude that, it's a long, tedious, and really expensive process, but I think it's worth it. I don't think if I would have tried to do this stuff in Europe, I would have been as successful. But you do need to be fully committed, and especially you have to be willing to accept help. I had a combination of, luck and hard work, but the most important part was just outstanding mentorship, a lot of help that, you can be proud and refuse, but that's stupid. In such a complicated process, you need folks to help you. So be willing to set pride aside and accept that help. All right, that's all I got for now. That's my email address and my Twitter handle. So please feel free to reach out anytime for any questions. I'm happy to take questions during the Q&A session right now. But if you think of anything that wasn't addressed, or if you think of anything down the line, here's how you can reach me. And yeah, thank you again for the kind invitation.